US President Donald Trump has said that he's aware of the conspiracy theories circulating around the sudden death of his ally, Senator Lindsey Graham, but declared that the FBI was wasting time investigating the matter.
It was supposed to be a routine call. Donald Trump answered the phone. Lindsey Graham was on the other end, just back from a demanding trip to Ukraine, tired from the travel but already talking about work, about the Save America Act, about what still needed to be done. No warning signs, no sense that anything was wrong. Just two men who had spoken hundreds of times, covering familiar ground, the way people do when they've known each other long enough that ordinary conversations feel like nothing. Hours later, Graham was dead. And when Trump spoke about the loss publicly, the words that came out of him surprised people who thought they understood the relationship. He didn't speak like a politician honoring a colleague. He spoke like someone who had lost a member of his own family. That reaction opened a question that Washington is still sitting with. What exactly was Lindsey Graham to Donald Trump? And what was it about this particular partnership between two men who once stood on opposite sides of one of the most bitter rivalries in modern Republican politics that made it become something neither of them fully explained while it was happening, how it started, and why nobody expected what came next? In 2015, Lindsey Graham called Donald Trump a race-baiting, xenophobic bigot. He publicly gave out Trump's personal cell phone number during a campaign rally. He said, "If you're a Republican and your choice is Trump or Clinton, you should move to Canada." These were not polite disagreements. They were open warfare. Trump returned fire. He mocked Graham on stage at campaign events, called him a lightweight, an idiot, someone polling at zero. The rivalry felt permanent, the kind of public clash that doesn't recover. And then, gradually, it did. As Trump's grip on the Republican Party tightened, Graham's position shifted. Their conversations became more frequent. Their arrests began to align on foreign policy, on the judiciary, on the direction of the party. Trump endorsed Graham's re-election campaign early, a signal that carried weight. What happened between them in the years that followed was never fully explained to the public. But by the time of that final phone call, the man who had once called Trump a race-baiting bigot had become one of the people Trump described as closest to him. That transformation is the part of this story that deserves examination. What Graham actually was behind the headlines. Here is what the public saw of Lindsey Graham. A senator who appeared frequently on television, who shifted positions, who was sometimes mocked for the distance between what he said before and after Trump's rise. Here is what people inside the Senate saw. Someone who could get things done when others couldn't. Trump, in his reflections after Graham's death, kept returning to this. Not to Graham's speeches, not to his television appearances, to his ability to navigate a room full of people who disagreed with each other and find a path through. Graham understood both the Senate and the people inside it, Trump said. He could reach people others couldn't. He could sit across from someone who opposed him entirely and find the thing that made progress possible. That description was echoed after his death by people who had spent years opposing Graham publicly. Senator Cory Booker expressed genuine shock at the loss and talked about their unexpected friendship, pointing specifically to their work together on criminal justice reform that helped produce the First Step Act. Senator Amy Klobuchar remembered traveling overseas with him and said his enthusiasm for representing the country never seemed to fade. Senator Elizabeth Warren, despite deep policy disagreements, remembered his humor and his respect in negotiations. Senator Adam Schiff acknowledged Graham's support for Ukraine. Senator Mark Warner praised his commitment to national security. These were not people who agreed with Lindsey Graham. Several of them had spent years in public opposition to him. And yet the reaction from almost every corner of Washington was genuine. That tells you something. Public politics and private relationships operate on different rules. Graham apparently understood both sets of rules better than most. The work he never stopped doing, Graham's final trip was to Ukraine. He came back exhausted. Anyone paying attention would have said, "Rest, take a day." The travel alone was punishing enough, and Graham was not a young man. Instead, the first thing he did was call Trump and talk about the Save America Act. Trump recalled this detail more than once in the days after Graham's death, not as a footnote, but as the center of the story he wanted people to hear. A man who had just crossed time zones on a demanding international trip, tired by his own admission, and immediately focused on the legislation he cared about. Trump said Graham loved being a senator, not because of the title or the recognition, but because he genuinely believed in the work. He believed that what happened inside those buildings mattered. that the conversations and the negotiations and the relationships were worth the effort, even when the effort was exhausting. That belief, according to Trump, never wavered. It's a particular kind of tribute. Not about achievements or victories, but about the consistent presence of someone who showed up, year after year, even when tired, even when the political climate made the work harder, even on the day before everything stopped. Flags were lowered to half-staff through July 18th. Trump ordered it, describing Graham as a dear friend and a truly great man. The gesture was visible across Washington, a quiet reminder that the career being honored had stretched far beyond South Carolina and far beyond party lines. South Carolina now faces the immediate challenge of replacing one of its longest-serving senators. A temporary appointment will be made while the state prepares for an election to complete the remainder of his term. Replacing the Senate seat is straightforward. Replacing what Graham brought to it is considerably more complicated. He had spent decades building relationships with people who disagreed with him. He had developed a fluency in the languages of multiple political worlds, conservative enough to maintain his base in South Carolina, pragmatic enough to work with Democrats on legislation that actually passed. He had credibility on foreign policy that came from years of engagement, from trips to Ukraine and Israel and Afghanistan, from conversations with military leaders and heads of state who knew his name and took his calls. That kind of capital is not transferred. It is built slowly over years through presence and reliability, and the kind of personal trust that doesn't survive being handed to someone else. Several observers noted that Washington's ability to find common ground on the hardest issues, already difficult before his death, just got harder. Whether or not you agreed with Lindsey Graham's politics, that observation is hard to argue with. In the days after Graham's death, Trump said something that has stayed with people who heard it. He said many Americans would appreciate Graham more after his passing than they had while he was alive. It's the kind of statement that sounds like ordinary eulogy language until you sit with it, because it implies something specific, that Graham's influence was not fully visible while it was happening, that the real work, the private conversations, the quiet negotiations, the relationships across enemy lines, was happening in spaces the cameras didn't reach. Trump wasn't describing a performer, he was describing an operator. Someone whose greatest contribution was not the speech everyone remembered, but the phone call nobody knew about. The conversation in a back hallway between two senators who had no reason to agree with each other, brokered by someone who understood both of them well enough to make agreement possible. If that is accurate, then Lindsey Graham's legacy is genuinely difficult to measure, because the most important things he did left no public record. What remains is the reaction. The Democratic senators who spoke at his memorial not as political obligation, but as people who had actually lost someone. The Republican president who described him as family. The flags at half-staff ordered by a man not known for understated emotional responses. Those reactions are the evidence, the public record of a private influence. What the last phone call meant. There was no warning in that final conversation. Graham sounded like he always sounded. Committed, engaged, already planning the next step. Trump didn't know it was the last time. Graham didn't know either. It was just another call between two men who had found their way, improbably, from bitter rivals to something that looked, by the end, very much like genuine friendship. The last thing Graham talked about was the work still to be done. That is not a bad way to be remembered, not by what you accomplished entirely, but by the fact that until the very end, you believed the work mattered and you were still trying to do it. Washington will have another senator from South Carolina. It will not have another Lindsey Graham, which is a complicated thing to say about someone whose career inspired strong reactions in both directions. But complicated legacies are often the truest ones. He started as one of Trump's loudest critics. He ended as one of the people Trump described as closest to him. And somewhere in between, in the spaces between the public moments, he apparently earned the trust of people who had every reason not to give it. That is a specific kind of achievement, not the loudest kind, but perhaps the most durable. A routine phone call that became the last one. A senator who came home from Ukraine exhausted and immediately started talking about legislation. A rivalry that became a friendship that nobody fully explains, even now. That is the Lindsey Graham story that Trump wanted people to hear. Now I want to know what you think. Do you believe Graham's greatest influence was visible? Or was the real work happening where the cameras couldn't follow? Drop your honest take in the comments below. If this breakdown gave you something to think about, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel. And subscribe if you haven't yet, because we cover the stories behind the stories. See you in the next one.